Montana Territory. Late autumn, 1881. On a wind-scraped ridge 12 miles south of what would become Helena, a widow named Sarah Hendricks was building something her neighbors couldn't understand. They saw the foundation stones. They saw the firebox. But when they looked beneath her cabin floor and saw where the chimney began, they stopped offering help. "Chimney goes up," one man said, "not down." What Sarah understood, what no one else on that ridge had figured out, was that the wind wasn't just cold, it was theft. Every standard chimney standing tall against the Montana sky was handing heat directly to the winter air. Her design would do the opposite. But first, she'd have to survive their laughter. If you want to see the exact numbers that silenced an entire settlement, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week, I bring you one technique that worked when survival wasn't optional. It was engineering. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because this solution works anywhere the ground freezes and the wind cuts deep. Now let's see what Sarah built. Sarah Hendricks hadn't planned to become a builder. She planned to raise 2 daughters alongside her husband on a homestead claim. But typhoid doesn't honor plans. By October 1881, she was a widow with 40 acres, a timber claim, and a problem no one else seemed to notice. The problem wasn't the cold. Everyone on the ridge dealt with cold. The problem was the wind. Montana wind doesn't just blow, it accelerates. It funnels through gaps, shears across ridgelines, and turns every vertical surface into a heat drain. The standard cabin design worked fine in wooded valleys. But up on exposed benchland where Sarah's claim sat, those same designs failed in specific, measurable ways. Chimneys created downdraft. When wind hit the top of the stovepipe at 30 miles per hour, it didn't draw smoke up, it forced it back down. Families woke to cabins filled with smoke. They opened doors to vent, which pulled frigid air across the floor. Children slept with wet cloths over their faces. Floors stayed frozen, even when the firebox glowed red. Her nearest neighbor, a stonemason named Jacob Morrison, burned through a cord pine every 11 days that first winter. His daughter developed a cough that lasted until April. His cabin stayed livable only in a 3-foot radius around the stove. Sarah had watched her own first cabin fail the same way. Small firebox, vertical chimney, pine plank floor. By January, ice formed on the interior walls. The floor was so cold her daughters refused to walk barefoot even at midday. She burned wood faster than she could split it. She couldn't afford to repeat that mistake. When she started laying the foundation for her new cabin in September 1881, she intended to follow the standard design. Firebox on the north wall, vertical chimney. Simple, but the foundation stones she'd hauled from the creek bed were inconsistent. Some cracked, some too large, some oddly shaped. She placed the firebox. Then she looked at the cracked stones she'd planned to discard, and she made a decision that looked, to everyone else, like madness. What Sarah Hendricks built beneath her cabin floor wasn't chimney, not in the traditional sense. It was a stone channel. She laid the firebox foundation as planned, river stone and clay mortar, set 18 inches into the earth for stability. But instead of building the chimney straight up from the firebox, she extended the exhaust path horizontally. She used the cracked and irregular stones to create a tunnel that ran beneath the cabin floor for nearly 8 feet before angling upward to exit through the rear wall. The tunnel wasn't tall, just 14 inches high and 16 inches wide. She lined it with flat creek stones, mortar tight with clay mixed with ash. Every 3 feet, she placed an iron grate salvaged from a broken stove, creating baffles that slowed the exhaust flow. Then she did something no one expected. She covered the entire stone channel with a layer of river rock. Smooth, dense stones between 4 and 8 pounds each. On top of that, she laid her floor joists. To anyone watching, it looked backwards. Chimneys go up to create draft. Hers went sideways, then up. But Sarah wasn't thinking about draft. She was thinking about heat. Here's what she understood. Exhaust gases from wood fire don't just carry smoke. They carry thermal energy. In a standard chimney, that energy shoots straight up and out. It's gone. Wasted. But if you force those gases to travel through a stone channel before they exit, the stones absorb the heat. And stone, dense, river-worn stone, holds that heat for hours. The floor above the channel became a radiant heater. She kept the firebox small. She kept the exhaust path clear enough to maintain draw. She angled the final vertical section to catch prevailing wind and create suction. And she wrapped the channel stones in a 6-inch layer of clay and straw insulation to direct the heat upward into the cabin instead of down into the frozen earth. When she explained this to Morrison, he shook his head. Heat rises, he said. You're trapping it in the ground. I'm storing it, she replied. Heat doesn't just rise. It radiates, and stone radiates for hours after the fire dies. Morrison didn't believe her. Neither did anyone else. By late November, Sarah's cabin was finished. The roof was shingled. The walls were chinked. The floor was solid. And beneath that floor, invisible to anyone who didn't know what it looked, ran 8 feet of heated stone. Her neighbors called it the underground chimney. They didn't mean it as a compliment. Jacob Morrison, who'd built 7 cabins on a ridge and considered himself the local authority on frontier construction, made his opinion clear. He stood in her doorway one afternoon, looked at the modest stovepipe exiting the rear wall, and laughed. You buried your heat, he said. That stone's going to fill with creosote, crack from moisture, and choke you with smoke by January. Chimney goes up, Sarah. It doesn't go sideways like a damn mine shaft. Others were less technical and more cruel. That's not a cabin, one woman said. That's a fire trap with a dirt floor. A freighter passing through called it widow's foolishness. Another neighbor said it looked like she was building a root cellar, not a hearth. The harshest comment came from a carpenter named Samuel Bridger, who'd worked on timber frame houses back in Ohio. He examined her foundation, traced the path of the stone channel with his boot, and said flatly, You're going to burn those floor joists from below, or you're going to suffocate in your sleep. Either way, you just built a grave. Sarah didn't argue. She didn't defend her design. She simply asked Morrison and Bridger to return in January and measure for themselves. They agreed, certain they'd be proven right. What none of them understood was that winter was about to decide the argument for them. January 1882 arrived with a cold front that territorial weather records would later describe as severe and sustained. For 3 weeks, daytime temperatures on the Montana Ridge hovered between minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit and minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. At night, they dropped below minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind speeds exceeded 25 miles per hour for days at a time. It was a kind of winter that separated functional design from fatal design. Jacob Morrison's cabin, built to standard specifications with a tall chimney and a central firebox, began failing on the second day. Wind sheared across his stovepipe and forced smoke back into the room. He had to crack the door to ventilate, which pulled freezing air across the floor. His daughter and wife huddled near the stove, wrapped in every quilt they owned. The floor stayed frozen. Ice formed on the water bucket 18 inches from the firebox. Morrison burned wood constantly. He woke twice each night to feed the fire. By the end of the first week, he consumed half a cord of split pine. What he'd planned to last a month. Samuel Bridger fared worse. His chimney developed a creosote blockage on day 4. Smoke filled his cabin so thick he had to evacuate his family to a neighbor's dugout. He spent 2 hours on the roof in minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit wind, clearing the pipe with a weighted chain. Across the ridge, the pattern repeated. Cabins built the right way were burning through wood, fighting smoke, and losing the battle to keep floors above freezing. Sarah Hendricks lit her fire once a day. She fed it in the morning, small splits of dry pine, slow burning. By noon, the firebox had cycled down to coals. She added 2 pieces mid-afternoon. By evening, the fire was nearly out, but her floor stayed warm. Her daughters slept on pallets laid directly on the floorboards. No need for elevated bunks. The air inside stayed clear. No smoke, no backdraft, and every morning, 6 hours after the fire had died completely, the floor was still warm enough to walk on barefoot. Morrison noticed on day 10. He walked past her cabin at dawn and saw no smoke from the stovepipe. He knocked. Sarah answered, calm and rested. Behind her, her daughters were eating breakfast in stocking feet. Your fire out? Morrison asked. Since midnight, Sarah said. Morrison stepped inside. He knelt and pressed his palm to the floor. It was warm. Stay with me. Because what Morrison measured next became a number that humiliated every expert on that ridge and changed how cabins were built for the next 40 years. Jacob Morrison returned to Sarah Hendricks' cabin on January 14, 1882, with a mercury thermometer, a notepad, and Samuel Bridger as a witness. He didn't come to apologize. He came to understand. They measured her cabin first. At 7 a.m., 6 hours after her fire had gone out, the floor temperature directly above the stone channel registered 52 degrees Fahrenheit. 3 feet away from the channel, it measured 48 degrees Fahrenheit. At the far wall near the door, it dropped to 41 degrees Fahrenheit. The air temperature at chest height was 46 degrees Fahrenheit. Then they walked to Morrison's cabin. His fire had been burning since 5 a.m., 2 hours of active flame. His floor temperature, 18 inches from the firebox, 34 degrees Fahrenheit. At the far wall, 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Frozen. Air temperature at chest height, 39 degrees Fahrenheit, but only within 6 feet of the stove. Beyond that, it dropped into the low 30s. Morrison wrote the numbers down. He stared at them. Then he asked Sarah how much would she burn in the past 10 days. Half a rick, she said, approximately a quarter cord. Morrison had burned a full cord in the same period, for times as much. But the most shocking measurement came that evening. Morrison returned at 9 p.m. Sarah's last fire had been fed at 3 p.m., 6 hours earlier. It was now dead coals and ash. Floor temperature above the stone channel, 49 degrees Fahrenheit. Morrison's cabin with fire burning actively, 36 degrees Fahrenheit at floor level. The stone channel was still radiating heat 6 hours after the fire died. Morrison's floor was frozen even with the firebox roaring. Bridger, who'd called her design a grave, stood silent. He touched the floorboards. He knelt and pressed his ear to the wood, listening for the crackle of embers below. There was nothing, just warmth, rising from thermal mass the way summer warmth rises from sun-baked stone hours after sunset. Sarah didn't gloat. She simply explained, in plain terms, what she'd built. The stone absorbs the heat while the fire burns, she said. It doesn't release it all at once. It radiates slow for hours. The floor becomes a stove. And because the channel is buried, the wind can't steal the heat. It stays inside. Morrison asked if the stones ever crack from thermal stress. No, Sarah said. River stone handles temperature change, and the clay insulation keeps the heat moving up, not down into the frozen ground. He asked about creosote buildup. I clean it once a month, she said. Takes 20 minutes. I pull the grate, scrape the channel, done. Morrison nodded. He folded his notepad, and then he said the words that Sarah had been waiting 3 months to hear. I was wrong. By late February 1882, the cold snap had broken. Snowmelt began. Families on the ridge tallied their consumption, their health, their losses. Jacob Morrison had burned through 2.5 cords of pine. His daughter's cough persisted into March. He'd lost a week of work to chimney maintenance and smoke damage. Samuel Bridger had burned nearly 3 cords and spent a combined 14 hours clearing creosote blockages from his chimney. Sarah Hendricks had burned 3/4 of a cord. Her daughters had stayed healthy. She'd spent no time on maintenance beyond monthly channel cleaning, and her cabin had remained livable, genuinely livable, through the worst cold the ridge had seen in a decade. Morrison didn't ask permission. He came to Sarah's cabin in early March with a notebook and sketcher foundation. He asked about stone selection, mortar mix, channel dimensions, insulation depth. Sarah answered every question. By April, Morrison had torn out his own firebox and rebuilt it with an 8-foot thermal channel running beneath his floor. He used sandstone instead of river rock. Denser, better heat retention. He added an access hatch for cleaning, and he angled the channel to follow the prevailing wind pattern Morrison had spent all winter cursing. That winter, 1882 to 1883, Morrison's consumption dropped by 60%. His floor stayed warm for 5 hours after the fire died. His family slept soundly. Word spread. By the spring of 1884, 11 cabins within a day's ride of Sarah's claim had incorporated underfloor thermal channels. Some use stone. Others use bricks salvaged from abandoned claims. A few experiment with clay-lined trenches filled with river cobble. The design variations were endless, but the principle remained Sarah's. Capture the heat you're already making, store in mass, and let it radiate slow. The term Hendrix Foundation entered local usage. Builders stopped mocking the underground chimney and started asking how deep to dig, how wide to build, what stone worked best. Sarah never charged with knowledge. She shared her measurements, her materials, her mistakes. She helped neighbors troubleshoot draft problems, creosote buildup, heat distribution. She became, without seeking the title, the Ridge's authority on thermal mass and radiant heat. What Sarah Hendrix understood, and what her neighbors learned the hard way, was that survival engineering doesn't care about convention. It cares about physics. Heat rises, yes, but stored heat radiates. And sometimes the wrong way is the only way that works when winter decides who stays and who leaves. Her cabin stood until 1937. The stone channel remained intact. And the principle she proved in that brutal January, that you can heat a home with half the wood if you store the heat instead of venting it, became frontier wisdom that spread across Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. Sometimes the best ideas look like madness, until winter proves them right. Now it's your turn. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced. Because Sarah's solution works anywhere the ground freezes and the wind cuts deep, and I want to know if you built a Hendrix Foundation today.